The sea was calm that morning, calm enough to hide the desperation of an army trapped on its own shores. From the white sands of Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of men stared toward England home, just across the water. Their rifles were useless, their backs pressed against the tide, and the German guns were closing in. Then, out of the haze, something impossible appeared: small wooden boats, civilian vessels sailing straight into war. Fishermen, ferrymen, and fathers steering into chaos with nothing but courage and a compass. It would come to be known as the miracle of Dunkirk. But miracles are never without sacrifice. By late May 1940, the beaches of northern France had become a trap. The British Expeditionary Force, alongside French and Belgian units, had been driven to the edge of the sea by the relentless advance of Hitler's armies. Behind them, burning towns filled the sky with black smoke. Ahead of them, the gray channel stretched toward home. But no way across. The harbor was wrecked. Ships that tried to dock were bombed before they could load a single man. Soldiers waited in lines that ran miles along the shore, clutching helmets and letters from home, their eyes fixed on the horizon. Every dawn brought the distant whine of German aircraft and the thunder of artillery echoing through the dunes. Officers spoke quietly of evacuation, but no one believed it was possible. In those moments, with the enemy closing and the sea as their only wall, one thought ran through every mind: would anyone come for them? Would England remember her sons stranded across the water? In the underground tunnels of Dover Castle, a small team of naval officers gathered around flickering lamps and sea charts. The date was May 26, 1940. Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, a calm man with weary eyes, had been ordered to attempt the impossible: rescue an army with no port, under enemy fire, using whatever could float. The plan was given a name: Operation Dynamo. Around him, telephones buzzed, messengers ran, and the faint sound of waves crashed against the cliffs above. Ramsay's orders were clear yet absurd: cross the channel, retrieve as many soldiers as possible, and bring them home before the Germans arrived in full force. Warships were too few, destroyers too vulnerable, and time was already slipping away. "We'll use everything," Ramsay said: ferries, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, anything that floats. As the signal went out, a quiet current began to stir along the British coast. In small harbors and rivers, ordinary men looked toward the sea, unaware that history had just called their names. Across Britain, from the Thames to the Solent, the call went out quietly but urgently. Naval officers appeared at boatyards and piers, asking one strange question: can she cross the channel? Some owners thought it a joke. A Sunday outing, perhaps, until they saw the look in the officers' eyes. Fishing boats, motor launches, lifeboats, and river cruisers were inspected, fueled, and marked with white paint. Some would be crewed by Navy men, others by their owners who refused to hand them over. In seaside towns, families watched husbands and sons push their small craft into gray morning mist, bound not for leisure but for war. They carried maps, compasses, flares, and hope. Each man knew the odds: strafing from above, mines in the water, no armor, no weapons, only courage. From Harwich to Ramsgate, engines coughed to life as hundreds of little ships gathered like a scattered armada. The English Channel had never looked so wide, nor so dangerous. But still they went. At Dunkirk, the air was thick with salt, smoke, and fear. Thousands of soldiers crouched in the dunes as the Luftwaffe's bombers swept overhead, their engines howling like thunder. Sand erupted with every explosion, and the sea boiled with burning oil from shattered ships. Men clung to whatever wreckage they could find: doors, barrels, planks, anything that might float. The tide carried the dead and the living side by side. Officers tried to keep order, shouting names that were lost to the roar of engines and the wind. Every so often, a cheer would rise when a ship managed to take a few hundred aboard before retreating again into the chaos. But the lines hardly moved. Some had waited for days, their faces raw from the sun and spray, lips cracked, uniforms stiff with salt. Letters from home were clenched in fists, prayers were whispered into helmets. They had come to fight a war, now they were fighting for the chance to go home. At dawn on May 28th, the gray horizon of Dunkirk began to change. Tiny specks appeared. First one, then dozens more, moving steadily across the rough channel waters. Through binoculars, soldiers on the beach saw something they could hardly believe. Fishing boats, pleasure craft, motor launches, even paddle steamers, all flying the white ensign. The first of the little ships had arrived. Many were crewed by naval reservists, but some by their owners. Men who had never seen combat, yet sailed straight through the air raids to reach their stranded countrymen. As they drew closer, soldiers waved helmets and shouted with hoarse voices. The rescuers smiled back, their faces streaked with sea spray and fear. Each boat could carry only a few dozen men, but together they began to bridge the impossible gap between land and safety. One by one, soldiers climbed aboard, shivering, silent, eyes fixed toward the sea. Behind them, Dunkirk still burned, but ahead there was hope. The channel that week was a battlefield unlike any other. The small boats were tossed between the wakes of sinking destroyers and burning freighters. Overhead, the Luftwaffe screamed down in wave after wave, their machine guns raking the sea. Spray and smoke mixed together until the horizon vanished completely. Crews ducked behind whatever cover they could find. A coil of rope, a crate, a friend. Some were hit and never seen again. Others pressed on, steering through wreckage and oil fires that spread across the waves. One fishing trawler from Ramsgate rescued 70 men before being sunk itself. A river launch named Sundowner dodged bombs for hours and brought home 31 soldiers. Each voyage was a race against time, fuel, and fate. The air smelled of diesel and cordite, the sea churned red and black. And still, more little ships came drawn by the single stubborn idea that even in chaos, they could save one more life before night fell. Everywhere you looked at Dunkirk, someone was doing the impossible. A young naval rating named Kenneth Moore tied his motorboat to a sinking minesweeper and refused to cut the line until the last man was aboard. A priest waded waist-deep into the surf, giving blessings to soldiers as they waited for rescue. A tugboat captain made 6 crossings under fire, his hands blistered from the wheel. One civilian crew. A father, his teenage son, and a neighbor spent 3 days shuttling men from the beaches to larger ships offshore, sleeping in turns, eating nothing but cold bread. None of them called it bravery. To them it was duty, decency, instinct. The skies above were filled with smoke and the thunder of Stuka bombers, but below, on the waves, the courage of ordinary men turned chaos into hope. Each small act added up to something vast and unspoken defiance that said, Britain would not surrender her sons. By the 5th day, the evacuation had become something no one could explain. Not a plan, but a miracle. Destroyers, lifeboats, fishing vessels, even yachts moved in a steady rhythm across the channel, guided only by faith and determination. Smoke rose in towering columns behind them, marking the beaches where thousands still waited. Yet hour after hour, more men reached the sea, waded into the surf, and vanished into the arms of the little ships. The weather turned rough, the skies stayed merciless, but the fleet kept coming. In those days, the channel became a living artery of survival, 338,000 souls carried home by courage, not machinery. Some ships returned riddled with bullet holes. Others never came back at all. But when the final tally was read, Britain realized what had happened. The line between disaster and deliverance had been crossed by fishermen, dockworkers, and ordinary citizens. They had turned defeat into endurance and endurance into legend. When the first soldiers stepped off the boats at Dover, they were greeted not by celebration but by stunned silence. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion, uniforms torn, boots soaked in oil and sand. Some cried openly when they touched solid ground. Women handed out tea in tin mugs. Old men offered cigarettes with trembling hands. No one asked questions. There was only quiet relief. Across Britain, church bells rang not for victory but for survival. Newspapers called it a miracle of deliverance. But those who'd seen the beaches knew better. It was no miracle. It was blood, smoke, and willpower. Every rescued man carried the sound of Dunkirk in his memory, the crash of waves, the scream of engines, the whispered prayers in the dark. And yet, within that exhaustion burned something fierce. A belief that Britain still stood, still fought, still mattered. Dunkirk had not ended the war, it had saved the spirit needed to win it. Years later, many of the little ships still float. Their wooden hulls scarred, their paint faded by salt and time. Some rest in quiet museums. Others remain moored in English harbors, their decks polished by proud hands. Every May they gather again, a flotilla of memory crossing the channel in peace. On board ride the children and grandchildren of those who once sailed into gunfire. They look out over calm waters and imagine the chaos their ancestors faced. The roar of engines, the spray of bullets, the desperate shouts now replaced by the gentle slap of waves. Dunkirk was not just an evacuation. It was proof of what ordinary people can do when the world seems to be ending. No medals could capture it. No history book could fully explain it. But as the tide rolls in and the sea glints under gray English skies, the story still whispers through the wind. When courage answered fear, the little ships sailed. By the fourth day, the beaches were littered with wreckage. Helmets half buried in sand, broken rifles, torn letters drifting in the wind. The tide washed in dark stains that no one wanted to name. The last British and French units held a thin perimeter, firing into the smoke while rescue boats darted in under shell fire. Many had no ammunition left. They used bayonets, fists, even shovels. Each trip of the little ships felt like a gamble against fate. Some never returned, torn apart by bombs or swallowed by the sea. Yet even in chaos, discipline held men lined up calmly, waiting their turn, knowing some would never reach the water. The horizon flickered red from burning fuel, and every new wave of evacuees looked smaller, younger, quieter. They no longer spoke of victory, only of getting home. And as the final launches pulled away, the beaches of Dunkirk stood empty, silent witnesses to courage carved into the sand itself. The channel that separated hope from destruction burned that week. Oil slicks from bomb tankers floated like black mirrors, igniting under tracer rounds. Smoke and flame blurred the line between sea and sky. Pilots flying low saw chaos below. Hundreds of small boats weaving through wrecks, dodging debris and bodies. Some carried 50 men, others carried one. A fishing trawler rescued survivors with bullet holes through its nets. A pleasure yacht towed a capsized lifeboat until its engine died. From above, it looked like madness. From within, it was order born of desperation. No one was in command anymore, everyone simply acted. It was courage in motion and sacrifice without pause. Those who reached over didn't speak of how many they saved. They spoke of those they couldn't. For every ship that returned, one was lost. But even that math could not measure what was gained, the living proof that the spirit of a nation could outlast the flames. While British soldiers evacuated, thousands of French troops stayed behind. They formed a last defensive ring around Dunkirk. Weary, outgunned, and surrounded. Their job was simple and impossible by time. Artillery shells fell like rain, and yet the French held the line. In makeshift trenches dug with helmets, they sang quietly between bursts of fire. When ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets, delaying the enemy one more hour, one more minute. British boats passing offshore saw the flashes of their rifles and lowered their heads in silent respect. Many Frenchmen knew rescue would not come for them. They chose to stand anyway so others might leave. When the final ships departed, their signals faded into static. Days later, the beaches were silent, the defenders captured or killed. History remembers Dunkirk as a British miracle, but it was also a French sacrifice, unspoken yet essential. Without those who stayed behind, there would have been no one left to save. At Dover, the rescued stepped ashore in disbelief. They were met not by parades but by silence and tea. Strong, sweet, and endless. Women in aprons pressed cups into trembling hands. Children offered chocolate and blankets. A few reporters scribbled notes, but none could describe the smell: salt, oil, smoke, and fear. Some men smiled, most simply stared. They'd left comrades behind, yet they were alive. That was enough. The harbor echoed with coughs, prayers, and the hollow ring of boots on steel. As the line of survivors stretched into the distance, word spread inland they came back. Factories blew whistles, church bells rang, and for a moment the war's shadow lifted. Dunkirk had turned retreat into resilience. For the first time in months, Britain believed again. They hadn't won, but they hadn't broken either. And that, in 1940, was a kind of victory no general could plan, only ordinary people could deliver. In the months that followed, many of the little ships returned to quiet civilian life. The owners went back to fishing, ferrying, or simple solitude. But some never spoke again about what they'd seen. The bodies drifting in the surf, the screams echoing across the water. A few boats were found adrift, their crews missing. Others washed up weeks later, burned and broken. Official records listed them as lost at sea, but those who'd been there knew what that meant. Not all heroes came home. When the government issued medals, many recipients refused them. They said they hadn't done anything special, they'd only done what had to be done. In pubs along the coast, men raised glasses not to victory but to memory. And as tides rolled in over their small harbors, the sea whispered their names: fishermen, teachers, shopkeepers, who sailed into hell with nothing but courage and a compass. Some of the boats came back scarred like the men they saved. Their wooden planks splintered from shrapnel, their names half burned off the hull. Yet every nail, every rope carried a story. A tugboat from Ramsgate limped home on one engine. A pleasure cruiser from Brighton returned towing 2 lifeboats and 50 exhausted soldiers. Dockhands cheered, mechanics wept, and the sea seemed to breathe again. Naval officers studied these humble crafts, unable to explain how they'd done what destroyers couldn't. The answer was simple: they'd refused to stop. The same hands that once cast fishing nets had hauled soldiers from death. No glory, no fanfare. Just grit and salt water. When the Navy men offered repairs, the civilians shook their heads. "Leave the dents," one skipper said. "That's proof we went." Those battered little ships, lined along the docks, became floating memorials long before anyone called them heroes. News of the evacuation spread slowly at first. Wire reports, rumors, whispered numbers. Then Churchill spoke. His graveled voice crackled through radio sets across Britain. "We shall fight on the beaches." People stopped in streets, factories, and schoolrooms to listen. They cried not because of victory, but because hope had survived. Newspapers the next morning called it the miracle of Dunkirk, but those who had seen it knew miracles were paid for in blood and smoke. Still, in every town square, strangers shook hands. Children drew boats on chalkboards. Women pinned tiny paper ships to their coats. Britain, which had been holding its breath since France fell, finally exhaled. For the first time, defeat felt like endurance and survival felt like defiance. The little ships had done more than save men, they had reminded an island who it was. Across the channel, the beaches fell silent again. Abandoned helmets rusted under the weight of sea air. Waves licked at wrecked trucks and burned out hulls. The smell of fuel lingered for weeks. French villagers picked through debris for scraps of metal, unaware they were holding fragments of a miracle. German patrols walked the dunes, puzzled that so many had escaped under their guns. They called it luck, but the sand told a different story. Boots pressed deep where courage once stood. In taverns across France, whispers began, "The English will come back." Fishermen said the sea itself had chosen sides. The gulls screamed above empty waters as if remembering names. Even the tide seemed slower, more solemn, as though carrying the echo of engines that would not quit. Dunkirk had ended, but its spirit crossed the water and stayed. It lived in the hearts of those who waited, in the faith of those who fought, and in every wave that still broke quietly on the French shore. Across the channel, the beaches fell silent again. Abandoned helmets rusted under the weight of salt air. Waves licked at burned-out trucks and twisted metal. The smell of fuel lingered for weeks. French villagers scavenged for wood and wire, unaware they were touching fragments of a miracle. German patrols marched the dunes, puzzled that so many had escaped under their guns. They called it luck, but the sand whispered another truth. Footprints where courage had once stood. In taverns, whispers spread, "The English will come back." Fishermen said the sea itself had chosen sides. The gulls screamed above empty waters as if remembering names. Even the tide seemed slower, more solemn, carrying the echo of engines that refused to quit. Dunkirk was finished, but its spirit had already crossed the water. It lived in the hearts of those who waited, in the faith of those who fought, and in every wave that still broke quietly on the French shore. When the last boats turned home, the sea looked strangely calm, hiding the storm it had survived. Smoke still trailed along the horizon, curling into the pale morning light. On deck, soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder. Muddy, hollow-eyed, too tired to speak. Some clutched their rifles. Others stared blankly at the water, watching the gray waves twist into ghosts. The old skippers kept their hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on a faint white line far ahead. When the cliffs of Dover appeared, someone whispered, "We made it." The word spread like warmth through frostbitten bodies. Behind them, the coast of France faded into smoke. Ahead, England waited, scarred but standing. For a moment, no one dared breathe. The channel was calm again, as if guarding their secret. They hadn't won, but they were alive. And in that fragile silence, every heartbeat felt like a promise that the fight somehow wasn't over yet. At Dover Harbor, dawn met them quietly. No bands played, no crowds shouted. Instead, there were nurses with blankets, dockhands with steaming mugs, and children holding flowers too big for their hands. Men stumbled from boats, their boots leaving muddy trails across the pier. Many didn't know where they were, only that the ground felt foreign after days at sea. Officers read soaked lists, calling names that drew no answer. Women wept into strangers' shoulders. A nurse knelt to tie a soldier's bandage and whispered, "You're safe now," but he didn't seem to hear. The newspapers would call it a miracle, yet on that pier it felt smaller, quieter, like something sacred. The little ships still bobbed in the tide, their decks scarred, their names barely legible. No glory, no victory, just gratitude. And as the sun rose higher, it caught on the water, turning the harbor gold, an ordinary light shining on extraordinary courage. Back across the water, Dunkirk belonged to the gulls. Boots lay scattered like forgotten prayers. Helmets glinted beneath the tide, their owners long gone. The sea crept up the beach and drew thin white lines around every piece of wreckage. French soldiers still fought among shattered streets, holding their ground so others could reach home. Smoke hung low over the dunes like mourning cloth. When the Germans finally arrived, they found an emptiness that defied understanding. Hundreds of thousands vanished overnight, leaving only silence and sand. They called it retreat. History would call it defiance. For those who had stood on that beach, it was neither. It was survival, raw and stubborn. The wind moved through the dunes, carrying the faint echo of engines that had come for them. And in that echo, the world could almost hear it. Not surrender, not defeat, but the steady pulse of hope refusing to drown. In London, Churchill read the reports alone in a dim office thick with cigarette smoke. The numbers were impossible. Hundreds of thousands saved, thousands lost. It wasn't victory, but it was something fierce, something unbroken. He leaned back, rubbing his temple, and muttered, "Wars are not won by evacuations, but they are endured by them." Outside, the city still bore the bruises of the Blitz, soot on the walls, shattered glass underfoot, but in the pubs that night, people talked of boats. Not destroyers or cruisers, but fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, river barges. They spoke of men who faced the impossible because someone had to. And for the first time in months, laughter returned, not loud, but genuine. Somewhere between the rattle of pint glasses and the hum of the radio, Britain remembered itself. Dunkirk wasn't the end. It was a beginning, lit by the small, stubborn lights of ordinary men who refused to let the dark win. Weeks later, the sea was calm again, but it remembered. Fishermen still found spent shells tangled in their nets, their boats rocking on water that had once burned. The tides carried bits of canvas, a rusted helmet, a fragment of wood with a name half scorched away. Children along the French coast built sandcastles over bullet casings, their laughter echoing through the quiet. The locals called it Le Miracle de Dunkirk, but the air still smelled faintly of fuel and fear. Some nights, when the wind shifted, they swore they could hear engines out on the horizon. Small, stubborn ones humming like ghosts that refused to rest. The Germans moved inland, but the shoreline stayed haunted. Dunkirk was not just a place anymore. It had become an idea, proof that courage could float. And when the sea turned silver under moonlight, even the waves seemed to whisper the same word again and again: return. On the voyage back, a young corporal sat against the rail, his fingers trembling as he wrote. "We were surrounded," he began, "but then we saw them. Little boats, hundreds of them. Not soldiers, not warships, just people. They came straight into the smoke." He paused, staring at the ink running from seawater on the page. "Tell Dad the sea isn't the same now. It looks different when you know it saved you." He folded the letter, sealed it with damp hands, and tucked it into his jacket. Weeks later, his mother unfolded it at the kitchen table, tracing the shaky words until her eyes blurred. She kept it hidden for years, pressed between Bible pages that smelled of salt and age. Long after the war, her grandchildren found it. The paper was fragile, but the message was clear. Courage doesn't always roar, it rose quietly, through smoke and fire, toward the impossible. By summer's end, the little ships were moored again along quiet English harbors. Their decks still bore scorch marks, their ropes stiff with dried salt. Some had bullet holes patched with tin. Others had names freshly repainted in shaky letters. Crowds gathered to stare, whispering as if in church. To anyone else, they were just boats. But to those who knew, they were monuments. The Navy offered to repair them, but many owners refused. "Leave the dents," one old skipper said. "That's proof we went." Children climbed their decks, unaware they were touching history. Seagulls wheeled overhead, crying over masts that had seen too much. When the tide came in, it rocked the ships gently, as though the sea itself were cradling them. They had done their part. They had come home. In the quiet slap of water against their hulls, you could almost hear the heartbeat of a nation finding its strength again. Years later, when peace returned, those who had sailed to Dunkirk spoke little of it. They went back to fishing, to ferrying tourists, to repairing engines. But sometimes, over pints in coastal pubs, the memories would surface. How the sea glowed orange under bombing runs, how men reached out from the water, how silence fell when the last boat left the beach. Their stories traveled quietly, passed from fathers to sons, from dockyards to classrooms. At memorials, wreaths were laid not only for soldiers, but for carpenters, shopkeepers, and sailors who had become heroes for a week. In museums, photographs of those small boats hang beside maps of great battles, and visitors often pause longer there. Because in their simplicity lies something pure proof that history is not always written by generals. Sometimes it's carved by hands that smell of salt, wood, and diesel. The beaches of Dunkirk are quiet again. Tourists walk where fear once lived, their footprints shallow over sand that remembers. The tide still rolls in, slow and patient, as if reluctant to disturb what lies beneath. On some mornings, fishermen swear they see shapes under the surface. Blurred shadows of boats that never came back. Seabirds cry in the wind, and the sound echoes faintly like distant engines. The sea doesn't forget. It carries stories in every current, holding them between its waves like folded letters never delivered. Somewhere beneath that gray horizon lies the truth of it all, not victory, not loss, but endurance. Dunkirk became more than a rescue. It became a reminder that even in retreat there can be triumph. And that sometimes the bravest act in war is simply to go back again and again until someone makes it home. Decades later, an old sailor stood at the harbor, his hand resting on a railing polished smooth by time. The sea smelled the same. Salt, rust, and memory. He watched the gulls dive and thought of that week when the sky itself seemed to burn. His boat was long gone, its wood scattered by storms, but he could still feel the vibration of its small engine under his boots, the tremor of fear and purpose running together. Once, reporters had asked him why he went. He'd smiled faintly and said, "Because they needed us." Now he said nothing. The wind carried too many voices for words to matter. He took off his cap, eyes fixed on the horizon, and whispered something only the sea could hear. Around him, children laughed, ropes creaked, and waves brushed softly against stone. Yet for a heartbeat, time folded, the sound of engines returned, faint and familiar, and the old man stood straighter, as if ready to sail once more. Each year, a handful of the old boats still make the crossing. Their paint is cracked, their timbers grown with age, but they move with the same quiet determination that once defied the sea. The crews are smaller now. Gray-haired men and women guided by memories more than maps. They leave Dover before dawn, engines sputtering in the mist, and as the coast of France rises ahead, the air feels heavy with ghosts. Some carry photographs tucked beneath the wheel, others a folded flag or a letter never sent. They know the route by heart, the same one where fire once met water. When Dunkirk appears on the horizon, the sea seems to pause, holding its breath. Then, without signal or order, every vessel sounds its horn. The noise echoes across the harbor, deep and trembling, like a promise kept. For a moment, the past and present move together and the little ships sail again. When the sun sets over Dunkirk today, the water turns the color of old steel. Fishermen cast their nets where warships once burned, and the tide still hums with memory. A few of the little ships remain polished, restored, their brass gleaming. But if you listen closely, you can hear what they once were. Not relics, not ornaments, but lifelines. The engines cough softly as they start, like hearts that refuse to stop beating. Veterans who can no longer sail sit on the pier and watch them go, eyes fixed on the horizon that once swallowed everything. Around them, the younger generation listens quietly, realizing that history isn't written in monuments, it floats on water, carried by courage. The waves lap against the hulls as if in salute, whispering a single truth through the wind and spray: the sea remembers. And as long as it does, the story of Dunkirk will never fade beneath its surface.